You also make the point about the safety is just that it's essentially fossil fuel use which has reduced the deaths associated with these hurricanes or basically things related to these types of weather events, but which also seem to be declining, not increasing, which is against the prevailing narrative, right?
You mean the actual incidents?
Yeah.
Well, I think the most important point is the danger is decreasing. So we often talk about climate change as this evil thing, and I think that actually reveals bad philosophy, because climate change really means man-made climate change. And what people are thinking is, oh, if we made the change, it must be bad. So this is part of this anti-impact philosophy, or really, I think it's a religion, where it's just human impact is bad. And so climate change caused by humans is assumed to be bad, instead of, hey, let's carefully weigh. What are the benefits of warming? What are the harms of warming? What about the greening? And then, of course, what about all the energy benefits that come along with it? So it's just a totally irrational way of thinking about it. The way you want to think about negatives in terms of climate is climate danger. That's the key concept. And so if you ask, what has happened to climate danger in the last 100 years? It's declined precipitously. And the best piece of evidence we have is that the number of deaths, or the rate of death from climate disasters like storms and floods and extreme temperatures and wildfires, that's down by a factor of 50. So that's down 98% in a century. And the reason is because the ability that fossil fuels and other technologies give us to master the climate, to neutralize climate danger, that ability is so much more important than any changes in the atmosphere. So sometimes people focus a lot on like, well, what exactly has happened to hurricanes, and is there a difference, and what will happen in the future? But the truth is that stuff doesn't matter too much compared to the ability to master it. The only way it would matter is if it was a total difference in kind. So if hurricanes doubled in intensity, that would be a huge challenge. But if you look at the literature, there are projections that they'll actually decrease in frequency and then increase 1 to 10% in intensity. That's not the kind of thing we should really be super focused on as a society. Again, we have 6 billion people who need a lot more energy. We ourselves could be a lot more prosperous. It's the wrong focus. And it shows the culture's not thinking in terms of human flourishing. They're thinking in terms of eliminating our impact.
I went to a school for my graduate work that had a prominent forestry school there. And one of the things you learn in forestry classes is that you mentioned wildfires. And basically when there's always a kind of a fire cycle in any area, and if you stop that fire cycle, you get these big catastrophic fires. You mentioned wildfires. This is why I think about this. Are wildfires really a result of climate, or are they a result of forest management, or is it
Well, wildfires, and it depends how specifically you're asking. I mean, in general, they're a result of nature, so they're just a natural phenomenon. But
I'm talking about these sort of big, seemingly catastrophic
right. So
ones,
unusually like catastrophic wildfires or out of control fires. I mean, those are, I think if you just think about it for a second, it's pretty obvious that it's bad practices involved, because you just think about, I mean, you've studied forestry, so it's easier for you to think about it, but just somebody thinks logically, like, if it got like 3 degrees C warmer, like 5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer, so far it's 1 degree C, so about 2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer, like, is it really possible that the Earth is just going to catch on fire and there's nothing we can do about it? Like, is that really likely? And you just think, no, it's not. What actually causes fires? I mean, there are ignition events, and then what causes them to go out of control is there's a lot of kindling for them. And so you can imagine, couldn't we rationally manage forests in a way where we would reduce the amount of kindling, including we can build barriers if we need to between different areas.
And people do this.
Yeah,
I just might add, right?
Right, they do this, but it's just logically, I just want to point to, there's this ridiculous fatalism when it comes to climate change type stuff, where people think, oh, we did the wrong thing, and then nature's going to punish us, and there's nothing we can do. And I think it shows it has a religious quality. It's like the climate god is punishing us, and we just sort of have to accept it. Versus in other realms, we don't. Like, just a little bit of a sidebar, but I made fun of Elon Musk about this years ago, because he's saying we can make Mars livable, but then he's warning that a 2-degree warming of Earth will be a catastrophe. How does that make any sense? You can make Mars livable, but your Earth 2 degrees, we can't handle it? So once you think technologically about the Earth, it's obvious, even if they don't have your expertise in forestry, that we should be able to avoid these fires. And then you look into it, And it's yet they manage the forests ridiculously. They allow what's called the fuel load to build up to these huge levels. They don't build barriers. They don't have, I mean, at least if we talk about California, where I'm from, there's just no rationality to the management at all. What we've done is we've just created this enormous environmental hazard. I mean, this is, I think, a literal fact. The California forest is the biggest environmental hazard in the United States. And if it were a private company, it would be immediately shut down. But you just have this unlimited source of fire that we just build up. We shut down logging. We don't clear enough brush. We don't do controlled burns properly. But it's totally a man-made thing. And the fact that we're focused on, oh, well, is there a drought so it's a little bit more conducive and did we contribute to that? That's A, obviously not the biggest factor, and B, it's so ineffective because we have no near-term control over CO2 in the atmosphere, because no matter what we do, the world is going to increase it, and even if we stop now, CO2 takes a while to leave the atmosphere. So it just really shows, I think, it's a perfect example of how people aren't interested in solving the problem. They actually like the problem to exist because it justifies their power and their attacks on various things like capitalism.
Okay, well, let's since you mentioned this, let's talk about this ideology, or you're calling it a religion, that's kind of driving a lot of these policies. So explain that to me.
So I call this the anti-impact framework, and I'll summarize it in one sentence, and then we can go into it. But I think the core of it is the idea that human impact on nature is intrinsically immoral and inevitably self-destructive. I think those are the key elements of it. So intrinsically immoral for us to impact nature, and then inevitably self-destructive. And so you can see this with the climate issue. Climate change, us impacting climate, which is what it means in practice, like that's viewed as just a wrong thing, which is very odd, because if you think about it logically, we would like to be able to change some aspects of the climate, like we'd like to neutralize, say, Hurricane Ian in Florida, that was fairly recent. But it's noticed that it's just climate change is just viewed as wrong. We shouldn't be doing it. It's playing God. It's tampering with nature, et cetera. And then the view is, so it has a quality of a commandment. Like I think of the environmental religion, its number one commandment is thou shalt not impact nature. And then, and really today it's thou shalt not impact climate. Again, that's viewed as the highest goal in all of society, is to not impact climate. That's what net zero means. But then notice if we violate the commandment, we get punished. And the world is going to become a hellish place. And notice all the consequences of climate change. They're supposed to be all bad. Like, think about how impossible that is, just logically. Like, how is it that, so what happens physically is we increase CO2 in the atmosphere. That has a warming and greening impact. The warming impact affects other parts of the climate system like storms and, other precipitation related things. How is it possible that all of that would be bad for everyone? It makes no sense, right? You're just changing a system. There will be good and bad. And my view is what matters is our ability to deal with it anyway. But it shows that it's really viewed as like we upset the climate gods and the climate gods are punishing us. It does have that quality to it. And the way I elaborated this is the goal is eliminating human impact. So I think that's the goal of the religion, or I sometimes call it the framework. And then the assumption, the reason that the view that it's self-destructive, the earth is going to punish us, I call this the delicate nurturer assumption, delicate nurturer. So the view that earth exists in a delicate nurturing balance, and you've probably heard delicate balance, you hear it in Disney movies, you see it in academic papers. But the three elements I think of the balance are it's stable, so it doesn't change too much. It's sufficient, it gives us enough resources as long as we're not too greedy. And it's safe, it won't endanger us much. And then the view of humans is we are what I call parasite polluters. So we just take from the earth and we ruin the earth. And on this view, our impact is bad. So the more we impact the earth is destroyed. And that's why you have all these catastrophists predicting the end of the world. And it doesn't happen, but they keep thinking it's right. And it has that quality where you have, an end of days view, like, oh, like everyone is going to die on this date. And then they don't, but then usually the people who keep believing it for the next date, like if they still believe in some, some guy on earth who keeps saying this, and it's similar to this, we believe in the delicate nurturer, and as long as we believe in the delicate nurturer, we're going to believe that catastrophe is imminent. So it's really, again, we shouldn't impact nature, and if we do, the delicate nurturer is going to punish us.
Well, let me ask you about this. One thing that I've been observing, and kind of a theme that has come out in all the different areas I cover on American thought leaders, is kind of the increase of the relativist view of the world and of reality, frankly. And that reality is purely what I perceive. And of course, there's only so many people that can believe that, because, as they say, reality has a way of punching you in the face when you stray from it too much.
Right.
But I'm wondering how much you think that has influenced things, because I see it everywhere, and it's something maybe a little bit different.
I'm curious how you, because I see it a lot of places. I'm curious how you think of it here, because in some ways it presents as the opposite, in the sense of there's a dogma element where it's just listen to the scientists, but the scientists are viewed as they have like the pure access to reality. But it's kind of like a religious leader where it's just like they have the access to the deity. So it's like, just listen to Michael Mann. He's the scientist, just do what he says. So I'm curious I'm curious how you might see relativism. I mean, relativism and dogmatism aren't exactly, they go together in different ways. But.
Sure. Well, I'll just tell you my kind of observation and sort of in different areas, just, people living more and more in the virtual world on screens. Let's say that, it's easier for me to believe. It's easier for me to just say, this is what I believe and this is reality. If this way of thinking has kind of crept into my view of the world because it's been, taught in the academy or taught in grade school and so forth. And so, let's take, this idea that if I don't, social distance, I'm going to kill grandma or something. There's all sorts of these mantras where on the face of it, when you sit down and think about it for a moment, you're like, this doesn't make sense, right? And it wasn't like you believed this before, right? This idea just kind of came in. Of course, maybe it was propagandized quite heavily, but somehow a lot of us accepted it, very well-meaning people. Right, and this is one example, but there's a million of them, and especially over the last few years, this kind of thing keeps recurring, and you have all these well-meaning people pursuing something that patently, on the face of it, when you really think about it logically for a moment, seems kind of absurd, right? That's what I'm thinking about.
It's interesting, but do you think they hold it as relativistic? Because it is weird, because there's a certain kind of relativist view, particularly on matters of science, where it's just like nobody knows what's true, and that's wrong. Like there's no knowledge or anything like that. But then, and that has a lot of problems with it. But then there's also just, well, science is whatever the scientists say, and what you really want is science is a method, and it's a method we have to get a better and better understanding of reality, and we want to take information or advice, or at least information, from people who follow that method, but part of that is they need to explain it to us, and they need to respect our independence to integrate that with other things. And unfortunately, I think you see, in so many fields, you see either the relativism or the dogmatism. I mean, maybe here's an example in climate that some of your viewers might find offensive. But there's this view of one side will say, hey, the science is settled, like, we need to get rid of fossil fuels. And so then there's a response that says, no, science is never settled. But I don't think that's a great response, because without qualification, it just means, oh, well, we can't ever know anything, so you can believe whatever you want to believe. It's like you can believe that there is COVID or there isn't COVID. That's okay, right? And that's not what it is. It's that science is not dogmatic, and that people believing it doesn't make it true, but you can still have progress in science. Like in a sense, you could say, well, the law of universal gravitation is sort of settled science. It's a dangerous term to put it either way, as settled or unsettled, but I think both of the response to people saying climate catastrophe is settled is not to say nothing is ever settled, so I'm not going to think about it. It's to say, no, actually, this is not settled at all. Like, there's no evidence that we have climate catastrophe. We don't have climate impact. And there's certainly no evidence that we should get rid of fossil fuels as a solution to that, because the benefits of those are so huge. So it is interesting how it's so common to have dogmatism and relativism versus a more objective approach where you really think in terms of scientific method, logical method. And that's what we really need as a culture, is a culture of scientists and other experts who explain things rather than try to dictate them. And if you have that, then you can really make progress.
Well, and of genuine, I think of it as genuine truth seeking, which is really what science is. It's a method to try to get at the truth of a situation, and we come up with models, and some of them work incredibly well, almost all the time. So we say, okay, that's settled. But then we sometimes find, a problem, which causes us to rethink the whole thing, right? And again, coming back to this relativism piece, right? I just wonder if we've kind of, a whole lot of people have maybe given up on this idea of truth seeking because maybe there isn't truth to seek.
That's true, but I think they've also given it in terms of, let's just listen to authorities. They say something this week that they didn't even think last week, right? Which is just, you notice how quickly the dogmas shift. It's just immediately this thing. And there's no recollection of what I believe, but it suddenly becomes my biggest conviction. You even see this with priorities on issues. So it's just some issues in the news, and then this is my biggest priority. I mean, there's the whole virtue signaling type thing, which is just like, oh, well, racism is now my life's passion to fight because I saw something on TV. And it's like, or like there's a storm this week, and so now climate change is my focus, and so that's a problem.
Global warming, it was global warming at one point, then it shifted to climate change. But this idea, and it's been, if we want to call it the fad or the way you're supposed to think, or you're relegated to the margins of society for quite some time. This one seems to have incredible longevity. What are the things that can kind of truly challenge such a long-standing perception, which, you argue pretty convincingly is not accurate? I'll qualify that anthropogenic climate change is a cataclysm,
catastrophic,
imminent cataclysm, exactly. Or something.
Perfect.
Right?
Yeah. Well, now you made me think about why is it so enduring, right? Which is an interesting thing, because I think part of it is, just to speculate on that quickly, I think part of it is it's not, I hate this term, but falsifiable, in the sense of, even if you make a specific prediction about change and it doesn't come true, you can still say, it's such a vague term, you can still say, oh, we had climate change, or we had impact. So it's something about, like if you just say, well, the world is all going to end from acid rain in this decade, like when you just, let's put it this way, when you speculate specific human consequences by a specific date, then that can be proven false. If you just say something vague like the climate is going to change and it's going to be really bad, then no matter what happens, it's easier to claim vindication, which is part of what's happened. You had predictions, it's vague enough, and you can, no matter what happens, you can sort of say you were right, because the Greens got burned on so many predictions, like, oh, well, England is gonna not exist mostly by this year. And so they start making vaguer and vaguer predictions. But the other thing is, because it deals with our use of fossil fuels, and specifically our CO2 emissions, it deals with a ubiquitous aspect of life. And if you're claiming a ubiquitous aspect of life is very damaging, that justifies unlimited control, which was actually part of the appeal of COVID to people, right? Is that breathing was considered dangerous. And so you had the right to control everyone's physical location indefinitely. So you saw that some people loved that idea. It wasn't just, oh, there's a danger, it's an emergency, let's just everyone sit in their home for a week while we figure things out. It's no, we might do this indefinitely. There was a lust for power with some of the people. So I think it has this, you can claim to be right even if you're wrong, and you get to control everything if it's true. So, I mean, I think the key is just making the two things. I mean, one is making the distinction between climate impact and climate catastrophe. I think that's a huge one. And then the other thing I mentioned is bringing up the benefits of fossil fuels. And another way to think of it is, what we should be really thinking of climate-wise with fossil fuels is fossil fuels have made the climate far safer. Like, that's the real narrative. Like, imagine somebody just came here from 100 years ago in a time machine. So like young Jan came, you came here just 100 years ago. Your experience of climate, if you just watched for a year what happened around the world, would be, your dominant experience would be, wow, climate danger has plummeted. That would be your overwhelming, I guarantee you it would not be the climate sucks now. That would not be your experience at all. I mean, maybe you could tell, oh, it's 2 degrees warmer, but probably not, right? What you'd see is, oh my gosh, when I was alive, like, it was common for 3 million Chinese people to get wiped out by drought and famine, and that doesn't happen anymore. or it's common for a few 100,000 people to get wiped out by a storm, or it would take years to recover from these events. And it's not like that, or a heat wave, could kill so many babies so easily. It's not like that anymore because we have such a mastery over climate. That's the real story. And I think my focus is let's reframe the whole thing where we're talking about human flourishing and we're talking about both positives and negatives of fossil fuels. And let's tell the true story. So one way I put it that's efficient is fossil fuels didn't take a safe climate and make it dangerous. They took a dangerous climate and made it safe. That's the real story. And part of that story is, we've had somewhat of a warming impact on the climate. That's only part of the story. And often people, they try to deal with things by just reacting to them, whereas often the solution is to reframe them.
Well, one of the themes that I keep getting as I was reading your book, as we're speaking right now, is that we've all kind of lost this ability to do cost-benefit analysis, which is exactly what you're saying. The real story is, let's look at the costs and benefits, and wow, do the benefits ever outweigh the costs?
Yeah.
Right.
And that's another way of saying, I think of it as, weighing the benefits and the side effects. And maybe a general thing is, I talk about this in chapter 11 of the book. It's called Reframing the Conversation and Arguing to 100. And it's advice on how to talk about this issue, but I hope that other pro-freedom people take it on other issues. And it's, just very quickly, I introduced the idea of arguing to 100 versus arguing to 0. And basically arguing to 100 means that you say, this is my goal, and then you argue that your policies get you to the good goal. So like the net zero people say the goal is to eliminate our impact on climate, and the Green New Deal will get us there. Now, I totally disagree with the goal and the policy, but that's a good model of how to fight for things. If you disagree with the direction of policy, usually I think you should challenge the goal. But usually often what people do, let's just say often, is they'll say, no, I agree with the goal of net zero, but the Green New Deal is inefficient, or it's not the right way to get there. And they try to shoot down the Green New Deal. I call this arguing to zero, because they just try to zero out the other person's policies, but they don't challenge the goal. Versus my thing is, no, I don't agree with net zero as a goal. That's a bad goal. Let's have the goal as global human flourishing, and then let's look at the policies that, if you weigh the benefits and the side effects of the technologies involved, what are the best policies to get there? And that's why I believe in energy freedom, including freedom for fossil fuels and nuclear and everything else. But I think in general, pro-freedom people need to more, what I call, reframe and argue to 100. If the debate's going in a direction you don't want, you should expect that the framing is bad and needs to be changed. Don't just react to the framing and try to come up with another clever way to shoot them down. Because even if you shoot them down 100% in one instance, you can't shoot down the direction if they're setting the direction.
And that's such a powerful lesson that, looking at the frame and deciding whether that is what actually makes sense in the first place. Powerful lesson to carry forward for all of us. Alex Epstein, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you all for joining Alex Epstein and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek.